Good afternoon, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Karis Circle. Karis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Karis Books, and Karis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are joined today by Katie Leikam. Katie is the author of Gender Identity Journal, Prompts and Practices for Exploration and Self-Discovery, which is on sale now at Karis Books and more. We are really excited to have Katie with us. Katie is a gender therapist and small business owner with 10 years of experience working with the LGBTQIA community. She is WPATH certified. She serves the LGBTQIA, transgender, non-binary, and genderqueer community with mental health and wellness services. She works with her clients with gender identity, anxiety, autism, relationship stress, family, and religious conflict, as well as coming out to others. Katie is also a speaker and educator, speaking at Gender Odyssey Los Angeles, as well as the United States Association of Transgender Health, and offers consultation to other professionals. Katie has been quoted in publications such as Huffington Post and is the author of the book that we are celebrating today, The Gender Identity Journal. So welcome, Katie. I'm really glad that you're here.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
So to start us out, and I guess I should say, part of the reason, sometimes we invite folks, other folks in our community to be in conversation with our authors. And one of the reasons that I chose to interview Katie myself is that I am one of the co-facilitators of Karis's group for parents of trans and gender nonconforming children, which is called the Gender Creative Parenting Collective, which meets on the first Wednesday of every month. I am also one of the supporters and sometimes facilitators of our group for trans and gender nonconforming teens, which is Trans and Friends. And then I'm the primary facilitator of our group for trans adults, which is just the Trans and Friends Adults group. And those meet on Mondays. So I'm always excited when we have new resources for our community, and wanted to hear a little bit about how you came into this work. What drew you to working with this population? I know that you're a cisgender woman, and so why this path in your life?
Yeah, so I actually grew up in a small town in Georgia, in Griffin. I grew up in a very conservative household. I had never met anyone, or had not known if I had met anyone that was trans until I went to college for my graduate degree. And I became friends with someone, and they moved away and came back. And when they came back, they had transitioned. So she and I became best friends. And through the course of our friendship, I saw some of the trials that she was having to go through with getting letters and having to be in therapy for 6 months before she could get hormones, and I started going to a meetup group of some wonderful trans women, and just kind of listened to the voices of people who were trans. And from that, I kind of got angry a little bit that people had to go through so many steps and burdens to become who they were. And I decided that when I got my license, my full license, I was going to open a practice working with the trans community. That's what I did.
So how long have you been in practice now?
I've had my private practice for 5 years, and I've been a therapist for around 10 years now.
So what sort of motivated you to write this journal and workbook? How did that come about?
Well, I was actually approached by the publisher to write with the idea of the book, and I thought it was a great idea. I've always been a writer. I've hosted spoken word, done on-stage storytelling, and I just love to write. So when somebody was like, "Here, write a book," I'm like, I jumped at it. This book in particular, I thought was great because I feel like it can be used either in conjunction with a therapist, or for people who might not have a therapist yet, to explore their identity. So I thought that it would, again, back to my theme of breaking down barriers. I thought the book would be a good way to break down barriers for people who need to explore their gender identity.
Yeah, one of the things that we were excited about is the price point of this book. It's affordable in a way that many books are not, not because, many people don't get to set the price point of the book. That's, it's not their fault that their books are expensive. It's just one of the vagaries of publishing. But it is important that people have accessible tools. And, one of the things that you mentioned is just even, 10 years ago when your friend was first transitioning, there were so many hurdles, and particularly this idea of the 6 months of therapy, the therapist letter. Can you talk a little bit about why that's a burden for trans people, and what's changed and what hasn't changed about that?
Yeah, so there's many reasons that's a burden for trans people. One of the biggest reasons is I don't think that people should have to prove their identity to an authority figure in order to transition. And that's, I'm a therapist, so obviously I want people to come to me for therapy, but there is a time and a place, and some people need it and some people don't. So people who don't need, intensive or even, 6 sessions of therapy shouldn't have to pay, shouldn't have to, purge, shouldn't have to. That's actually a word that used to be in the WPATH standards. So people shouldn't have to do that. If, my trans clients are in charge of their own identity. I'm not the one that's in charge of their identity. So they should have agency. People should have agency to, be who they are without barriers. And then how it's changed over the years is, like you said, 10 years ago, my friend had to, go to 6 months of therapy, get the letter. I think for a while, people had to present for at least 1 year in the gender that they were transitioning to, which creates safety concerns. Right now, I have lots of clients that transition after they start hormones because it's just a safer experience for them sometimes. So it's really gone the gamut, and now there's multiple and several informed consent clinics in Atlanta. And what that means is that someone over the age of 18 can walk into a doctor's office and tell their doctor that they're trans and they want to start hormones. The doctor will tell them the risks and expectations of what's going to happen to them, and they will agree as a legal adult, and that's that.
Yeah, it's always been mind blowing to me that the expectation for so long was that you should socially and legally transition prior to receiving access to medical transition if that's what you wanted, because that is, like you said, it's often really dangerous and arduous,
Yeah.
right? I know for myself, I absolutely wanted access to hormones prior to changing my name, or going to court and trying to change any of my documents, because in general, cis people, but especially courts and doctors, they're not super respectful of trans people who don't already look like what
Right.
we're supposed to look like. And that transphobia is, it's bad enough for people who are transitioning in a binary way, but if you're a non-binary person, that you know your identity may never look like what some cisgender authority thinks it's supposed to look like, that standard can be especially arduous.
Right.
And I think the question of what is helpful. We do know that trans people experience higher rates of mental health stress, but so often there's a chicken or the egg kind of question of like, where's
Yes.
the stress originating from? Is it
Yes.
because of all of these hoops that we're being forced to jump through, or is it something else? And so, I mean, that's a bit of a leading question, but it would you say, you basically said, I do want people to come to me if they want to come to me, right? So,
Yes.
are there ways that you think we can be lowering the barriers to, positive mental health spaces for trans and gender nonconforming people without being gatekeeping about it?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I do now is that, there are doctor's offices in Atlanta that do require letters to start hormones. And so I write those in one session, if at all. I mean, it's 99% of the time I could do it. And, I always tell, if somebody comes to me, it's funny, it's not funny, but people come to me and they're really hesitant and they'll fill out the paperwork and they're like, I want to explore myself, and it's like, and then we get in session and they're like, no, I really just need the letter. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. Like, let's just do that. You don't have to come back. Like, we don't have to build this long build up, we can just do it. But then that also speaks to kind of the fear that the trans community has, that they have to conform to, like what you said, like someone who is cis, what they expect them to do, which is wrong.
Yeah. One of the things that I like about your book a lot is that I think it's useful to all people. And one of our sort of central tenets at Charis, because we're a feminist organization, is that feminism is for everybody, but also that homophobia and transphobia really are a larger, symptoms of patriarchy and living under a patriarchal culture. And that if we could dismantle patriarchy, a lot of the deep wounds of homophobia and transphobia might be corrected, because so much of trans antagonism is about really hating the feminine in people, or wanting to keep people in binary genders so that men feel safe and powerful, right? And so one of the things that I think is useful about your book is the idea that all people, really, cisgender identifying people who are questioning their gender, people who already know they're trans, can benefit from doing some prompts and practices to explore their gender. So could you talk a little bit about how you hope people might use this book and who you kind of think this book is for?
Yeah. So, and I do agree with you very much, is that anybody and everybody of any gender identity can read these prompts and really think about their gender. That was the purpose of the book, especially what I wanted to do, what the publisher wanted to do, was make a book that anybody at any point in a path could pick up this book and start it, whether or not they're questioning, whether or not they've already transitioned, whether or not they're cis and just want to learn more about what a process of exploring gender identity is. The book was written with no expectations that the reader would end up transitioning.
And I think that's really helpful, especially to parents of trans and gender nonconforming children. When we are working with parents, what we see so often is all of a sudden, it's a little like the Matrix, right? It's like all of a sudden they go into doctor's offices and they're like, oh man, I have to check a box for my kid, male or female, and my kid's non-binary, or I have to sign them up for, summer camp, and they can't go to summer camp now because this summer camp won't let them do this, or my church, all of a sudden I realize it's super homophobic, or, whatever the thing is that they had just taken for granted their whole life, all of a sudden, because they're advocating for their child, it's like, it hits them how binary the world is, how transphobic the world is, how heteronormative the world is, all those things, right? And I really believe that when what I also see is a lot of parents then start to have their own revelations about their gender, about their marriages, about their sexuality, like all of it. Once you start excavating, like, oh, this is an unjust system that's hurting my child, that actually often can help liberate the parent and make even the most cis normative straight parent be like, oh, right, this is bullshit. Why are we doing this? Right. And that's an exciting thing to me. And I actually think this is the gift of, the sort of gender rebels of the world, is like this. We don't just do this, for ourselves. Ideally, there is a space for the liberation of people of all genders and sexualities. Right.
And it's everywhere. Gender constructs are everywhere. I think about, I even think about my own son, and like the chores we have set up in our house. Like, why is why is it my son that takes out the trash? Why isn't that my chore? There's it's embedded. It's even I think I was telling you before we started is that even the most progressive parent probably doesn't realize that they're still following some sort of gender norm or gender construct.
Yeah. And what we all find out is there's pretty heavy punishment for not following those constructs. The systems are very much set up for people to go with the flow, and whether that's just like minor social embarrassment or that can be funny sometimes. I remember my mom using non-binary. I use both non-binary pronouns and he him pronouns, and my mom and I went out to dinner. We were at a table at a nice restaurant, and my mom said it's their birthday and pointed at me, and the guy brought out 2 desserts because he just assumed that it was like me and someone else's birthday, right? Because he just couldn't even wrap his head around that I could use non-binary pronouns, right? So little stuff like that that's funny to really horrible, painful, coercive gender norms that we see just really destroying people's spirits, and that is just like it runs the gamut. And so when people when you were thinking about this book, how did you decide the order or the structure of the book? Because it's in 7 sections,
right?
Did you write it in this order, or did you?
I did write it in that order. I started from the very beginning and wrote to the very end. And I think what I wanted to do was, in the most kindest, almost fragile way possible, is have someone explore their gender. Nothing really mind-boggling, nothing really triggering, is what I tried with my prompts and exercises. And then towards the end of the book, I put a whole chapter for self-care, and I put a chapter for negativity, because especially I know adults have negativity too, and the book was written mostly for adults, but I work a lot with start with 6th graders and work on up. And the getting on Discord servers or Reddit posts or Instagrams in their messages, kids can really get bombarded with just this negativity about their identity. So I put a chapter in to break down your negativity to make sure that you're keeping yourself safe.
That's such an important point. And I'd love to talk a little bit about technology, because one of the things that we're seeing right now, just anecdotally, but I talked to other therapists, other folks who work with trans folks, and they're seeing this too, that there's a sort of massive number of folks coming out and exploring their gender right now. And I attribute that to the fact that so many people are, they're having their experience mediated by screens, whether that's kids in schools who have been less, forced to sort of walk the gambit of the high school hallway all the time. They're not being so caught up in the day-to-day physicality of what it means to have their gender mediated by so many, cliques and social expectations at school. Obviously that's still there in a digital classroom, but it's less so because you're sitting, it's the neck up, which I think a lot of trans people already kind of feel, or at least from my own experience, I often experience dysphoria as like just this sort of floating head feeling of like, well, I just am my brain and everything else isn't really me. So there's that, but then also a lot of adults, especially those who've had the privilege of working, in a more remote way, or even a socially distanced way in a physical space from their other colleagues. It's like, oh, I finally have the space or the time or the distance to experience my gender without so many other people's input.
Certainly, I've had several clients, that have transitioned in the workplace because they can keep their cameras off while they're doing Zoom. So they've had this like opportunity to explore themselves over the course of this pandemic. And then when they were ready, physically, mentally, presentation wise, then they were able to come out at work because of the technology of Zoom.
There was just an article in the New York Times today about cisgender pregnant women choosing not to disclose their pregnancies until after their children were born, because the technology of Zoom allowed them to conceal their pregnancies, and about what that opened up for them to not be hyper visible as pregnant people in this space of work where people
Mm-hmm.
felt entitled to their bodies, entitled to talk about them, to talk about them as mothers, all the anxiety of being pregnant in a time of COVID. Like, they chose, like, well, I don't want to talk about it because I'm already worried that my pregnancy is not going to, go well. So I'm just going to try to mitigate the people who might comment on this and mitigate my own anxiety by just keeping it private. And I thought a lot about all the trans people I know who are transitioning, behind Zoom screens. And to me, it's a
Yeah.
very similar thing. It's like all of the gendered stuff that gets put on cisgender people, around parenthood, that often is a time when gender becomes visible to cis people. Like, oh, you're having a baby, now you're suddenly this thing that society owns, right, as a woman.
Right.
um and it struck me as funny, that we would be having this conversation, because I was like, yeah, this is one of the few times that I think cisgender women are experiencing that kind of thing that trans people are experiencing right now. But
Yeah.
um you know what we also are seeing is parents saying, well, if they're not even in school really with their peers, and this is all kind of happening because they're in digital space, is it real? How do I know this isn't a fad? How do I know this isn't a phase? Now, obviously, I have my feelings about this, but I'm curious what you say to parents about that.
Yeah. So as soon as you said that you felt like people were transitioning more because of screens, I was like, whoa, hold up. Let's stop for a minute, because I don't want to go into this like rapid onset.
Right.
I don't want, that's wrong. So I want to make sure that that is a different conversation and we know that that is wrong.
Yes.
Um, so how do you know it's real? I think somebody, I think so, I think what's really gets me, and I've seen people people don't question cisgender people's gender. It's just known. I'm a cisgender woman. Nobody's going to ask me, are you really a cisgender woman? Like, are you sure? Um, and that really sits with me. Just as, knowing that nobody is questioning my identity. So what gives us the right to question someone else's identity? But with kids, and I think we don't give, and I say kids, I should say teenagers, but I'm old, so everybody's a kid. Um, so with kids, I think we don't give them enough credit for their own agency and their own, you know, the what kids tell parents is like light years away from the conversations they're having with their friends. It's like the difference between um, reading a menu at a restaurant and like reading Play-Doh. You know, um, we as parents, I'm a parent, and my kid gives me brief, 3-word answers, but I've got to know that he is a whole person, and that with his friends, he's got a whole system of emotional support that he can he know he will know his identity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that I 100% agree. You mentioned rapid onset, and that's, for folks who don't know, that's a right wing buzzword right now, or buzz phrase. Um, and it's particularly being used against trans boys, particularly this idea that there's a transgender craze that is sweeping up.
From
Uh,
like YouTube and
yeah,
yeah.
and that trans boys and non-binary kids who are more masculine are experiencing a phase as a result of patriarchy. That it's hard to be a woman under patriarchy, or a girl, or a teen girl, and therefore we are losing our girls to the transgender craze, which obviously is a really transphobic idea. And so, yeah, I think of this moment as a disruption that's allowing people to experience themselves in ways that are innovative and not how they would have otherwise gotten to experience themselves. So to me, it's like it's a disruption that's offering an opportunity to know more about themselves earlier. Like I just assume all these people would just come out in a few years. So maybe it's just giving them the opportunity. But I definitely assume all these people would have come out as trans at some point. It's just here's this sort of great societal, in the same way that lots of people are realizing they hate their jobs, or they're getting divorced,
Right.
or it's causing this corruption, but it is not because it's not real. It's because our orientations to the world are changing in lots of ways across lots of facets of our identity.
Right. And when I work with, you mentioned the word like elder trans people. When I have had the privilege of working with some elder trans people, while you don't always have to know your gender identity when you are a child, I think back to these people who are like 50, 60, 70 years old, and they knew when the same age as the kids that we're saying are like rapidly figuring things out, except the climate was so different that they had to hold this on for these decades. And like, why would you put someone through that pain?
Yeah.
Why would you do that?
Or they didn't have the language. I mean,
Yeah.
Even if you like didn't even know that was a thing you could do, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I still see clients that, are from like rural areas or conservative families, and they'll tell me that, they'll come to me like late 20s for a top surgery letter, and they're like, well, I didn't know that this word even existed until I was like in college at 21.
Yeah. I mean, I am somebody who grew up with a lot of resources, grew up at Caris, but I didn't understand how capacious a term and an idea trans actually was, because I, growing up in the 80s and 90s, only knew stories of trans people. I knew a very old narrative about trans people, which was that you really had to be so miserable in your body, and you had to be basically suicidal, and you had to be willing to cut off all contact from your family and move away from home and start a new life, like basically kill the person you had been and begin again. And I was like, I don't think that's me. Like, I don't, but all the rest of the pieces of my story were very, like traditional kind of trans narrative stuff in terms of masculinity. But I just was like, well, I don't hate myself, so I must not be trans. And then I'm like, well, that was a horrible transphobic idea that somebody had put in my head. But I didn't know that until I saw trans kids much younger than me on the internet be like, yeah, anybody can be trans. Yeah, like there's no burden. Like there's no amount of trans that you have to be to decide that you want access to medical transition, or you want to use these words about yourself or whatever. But that my mind was kind of blown, so I
Yeah.
transitioned a little bit later than I might have, because of that, right? And I think that's true for a lot of people. They think like, well, I'm not trans enough, or I don't, or there are other legitimate family concern, or I have to wait till my mother dies, or I have
Yes.
to wait till.
Yes.
I mean, I think that's true of a lot of people, that they feel, well, I have to get away from my family, I have to leave my home church, those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
And you have some of that in the book, really exploring barriers. So can you talk about like how you help people think through, because transition does not always go well. We don't always get to carry every person in our life from before, and every community we're part of. Like not everybody, sometimes that can be confusing, right? Like media sometimes tells us like, oh, everybody's gonna be on board with this. That's not always the case.
Right.
How do you help people think through, okay, well, you may lose some people, that's real?
Yeah. So certainly as a therapist, I'm very real and very kind of blunt, kind of conversational and go with the flow. And it is true that you might lose people along the way, and what I do, at least in sessions and even in some of the prompts in the book, are try to build up your protective factors and your resiliency. So protective factors would be like if you could think of yourself with like a force field, um, who would be in your force field? Would it be, your friends from your Discord chat, or would it be your best friend, or would it be even your mom, or would it be not this church, but the spiritual living center, which is trans affirming. So if you know that you're going to have negativity in your life when you transition, then I really try and get my clients to have a protective, like, force field, so to speak, before they start transitioning, so that they can have people in place to fall back on when that negativity does start. And then resiliency, which is, knowing who you are and being able to stand up in the face of negativity and, tell yourself. There's an exercise in the book, the chair exercise, which pulls from Gestalt therapy, where you literally sit a chair in front of yourself and you talk to yourself in this chair in front of yourself. So that's, building up resiliency and self-talk and self-affirmation.
So for I imagine there's at least 2, maybe 3 audiences who are watching this talk. One is trans people who are adults who, are considering whether this workbook is for them. One is probably parents of trans or gender nonconforming kids who are, maybe thinking about how this can help them. And then one is clinicians and therapists who might like to use this as a tool in their tool belt. So I'm wondering, when we actually have a question in the chat from a therapist who asks, as a therapist, how can I use this with my trans and questioning clients? So maybe let's start there and kind of talk about how for each of those populations they might use the book.
Okay. So as a therapist, I would, if it were me using my own book, I would use my prompts and exercises in session. You start with a prompt or an exercise and ask your client to self-reflect, either on the spot or as homework, and bring it back into session. I recently had a client that got the book and filled out the book themselves, and they were going through some prompts that they had difficulties with, so we processed those prompts together in session.
Great. So for parents and cisgender parents of questioning or trans kids.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about this earlier. Is for parents who are thinking about buying this book, first of all, the book is written so that there's nothing too adult in the book. So if you're thinking about getting it for your teenager, I would say maybe high schooler, maybe middle school is fine. There's nothing not too adult themes in the book, so that's fine. And then for yourself, if you've ever thought about how you raised your child in your household, and the gender constructs that were in your household, or even the gender constructs that were in your household growing up, your mom, your dad, and how you were raised and how that trickled down into your own children, this would be a good book to explore.
Yeah, one of the things that we really encourage parents to do is to think about, like on Thanksgiving, where did people who got to sit in the living room and watch football, and who had to be in the kitchen cleaning, like all that stuff, all that kind of unconscious stuff comes up. And even if you are actively pushing against it now, you still need to acknowledge your orientation, kind of where you're starting from, so that you can begin to dismantle it. And a lot of folks, as we've already said, like don't have a lot of incentive to do that until their child is in crisis, or maybe not in crisis, but is bringing up these issues in the family.
Right.
And then finally, go ahead.
And to be a parent and to be able to, have a sit down with your child and say, I recognize that, when you were growing up, this is how we did things in the household, and I might have been wrong in doing that. Or maybe I wasn't, maybe I wasn't wrong because I didn't know any better, but this is why I didn't know any better, is because my parents did this and now we've done this, and you can change it when you have your own children. If you choose to have children, like, you can break these patterns.
And a thing that comes up a lot is multi-generational, particularly because in COVID, a lot of folks are in multi-generational households right now, we're living with grandma or living, with aunts and uncles or whatever, because, for a lot of reasons. And that is a crisis of, like, parents are doing great, kids are doing great, grandma is not doing great. Grandma is not on board. Grandma is not supportive. Grandma is not using appropriate language or pronouns, or is really questioning stuff. And so a lot of parents are looking for resources about how to deal with their adult parents, to defend their family values for the family they have made. Again,
Right.
the family, they're trying to stay in loving contact with their parents or their larger nuclear family, but it's hard.
Right.
And so I wonder, if that is something that you see a lot in your job.
It is something I see. I've worked with people who have grandparents in the home who aren't affirming, um, and it is difficult. It's really difficult to change someone who's at that age that just can't open their eyes. But I did want to point out that I've also worked with kids who scared to death to tell their grandparents, and the grandparents were more affirming than the parents were. So it goes both ways. Sometimes the grandparents are the ones that are like, you know what, I love you unconditionally. There's no conditions on my love because I'm your grandparent.
I appreciate that reminder, because actually that's very true of my experience too. Sometimes it's a grandparent who gets in touch with us to say, my son is really messing up his kid, but the kid is great, and I need resources because I don't want to, I don't want my kid to mess up his kid anymore, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And yeah, it is not about age. It's about sort of, often just one's emotional and political orientation. So, so then, the third audience for this book is most obviously trans people, or people who are questioning their gender and want to use this either, for sort of an at-home processing or in conjunction with other therapeutic tools. And so, kind of, that is the most obvious audience for this book. But is there anything you want to say to folks who are thinking of picking up the book for those reasons?
Yeah. If you're thinking of picking up the book, I do think it's a great resource. I would tell you to take your time. You can go through as fast or as slow as possible. For some people, these prompts might be very emotional, especially if you're in the very beginning of your process, and you haven't explored any of these themes before. So just take your time with the book. Don't feel like you have to rush. There's no time limit, and it doesn't have to be completed in order. So if you start with the first chapter of exploring your gender identity and you find that you're getting a lot of emotions, you can flip, I believe it's chapter 6, which has all the coping skills and the self-care techniques, and go straight to that, and then come back to the exploration once you've got your coping skills down.
What were there any prompts, now that folks are using the book and it's out in the world, are there any prompts that you are finding are particularly, like, resonant for folks or have become favorites?
Yeah, I've had someone. There's a prompt in there about doing an archaeological dig through your life, and like looking at the layers of how you built your gender identity. That seems to resonate with people. And then there was a prompt a client told me the other day about an obstacle wall, like having to go over your own obstacle wall, and get the tools to be able to jump over. Really resonated with people.
Was there anything that surprised you was maybe more emotional for people to do than you thought it might be, or more upsetting or hard?
Um, I think, Yeah, I think looking back on how people were raised and the permissions that their parents gave them has been kind of emotional for people, because uh, I'm just going to say clients, but people, they don't want to place blame. Nobody wants to place blame on your parents, but you also don't want to place blame on yourself. And there is no blame in gender identity, first of all. But I think that's what people go to is, the why, the how, and I think that becomes kind of emotional for people.
That makes sense. Did you have a favorite part of the book as you were writing it?
Um, I enjoyed writing the terms, because I was given a list of suggested terms, and I added some more, um, to make it a more well-rounded list. Um, I was just doing a supervision group yesterday morning for a group of therapists, new therapists, and I was reading the terms, demi boy, demi girl, two spirit, and it really surprised me that people hadn't heard of many of them. And I don't know. I guess that goes back to what I was saying, where we're in this bubble indicator, and it just surprises me. Sometimes I have to stop myself and think, not everybody knows what no, not everybody knows what you know. Not everybody is as affirming as that.
Well, and you've mentioned, Discord and, online stuff. A lot of the language uh, of trans identities has been sort of coalesced in online communities. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and and I think there are people who are massively online and then people who are very not online. And sometimes
Yeah.
that also seems like a divide to me. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
even more than almost even more than where you live or anything else. It's like if you are sort of part of the online discourse, whatever that looks like, and sometimes that's in different platforms at different times, right? That sort of migrates. Um, it can feel like, oh, you have a giant community, because even if you don't know a single other trans person in real life at all, you might know thousands of trans people online.
Yeah.
Um, but I think sometimes people who are maybe older or don't not super online, they kind of are like, I don't know how I'm supposed to find anybody, like how do i
Yeah.
how do I meet people, um but as you said, there's also a lot of ugliness and meanness online. And so as you're thinking about people finding community, but particularly online, since so much is happening online right now. How do you encourage your clients or just anybody who's curious to go about finding healthy online trans community?
Yeah. So, I've mentioned Discord, I've mentioned Reddit. Um, I think support groups are a huge tenet of finding community and meeting other trans people and being in your space. I know I've referred people to your group many times, especially people who said, I've never met someone who's trans. And I'm like, well, you have to go to a group, well, not, you don't have to, but you should go and meet somebody, see somebody. There is something to be said for seeing someone face to face or screen to screen, um, another living being that holds space for you. Um, and there's meetup groups, there's uh, Facebook groups. It really just depends on what medium you're in. If you're only on Instagram, then you can follow, trans people on Instagram and comment, and there's many ways to find your community. um, if you're looking for something in person, there's an Atlanta Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce, out Georgia, in Georgia. There's many opportunities to find your community.
Yeah. So we've actually covered a lot of ground. Is there any part of the book that you want to make sure we get to talk about that we haven't discussed yet?
Um, Let me think. I think we've covered most of it. Just exploring your identity, breaking down your past, building up your protective factors, handling negativity, and then next steps. I guess that's one thing that we didn't cover is what are the next steps. You go through this book, and then what's next. And I think the answer to that is, first of all, it depends on what happens when you go through the book.
Yeah.
You know, your next steps could be that you've just got a deeper understanding of how you grew up, or your next steps could be that you've built coping skills. Your next steps could be that you want to come out to a friend, or that you want to pick one person, to share your identity with. Your next steps could be that you find a therapist, or go to a support group like the CARE support group. It really, I think at the end, I don't want the readers to feel like they're just hanging in limbo. There are next steps.
Yeah, I think that's so important because I think that is sometimes the fear or the worry about doing a therapeutic book on your own, is that you can sort of dig up all this stuff and then be like, where do I put it? What do I do with it?
Yeah.
And if you don't feel like you have access to good therapeutic care, well, for one thing, we can all at Caris, we do have lots of good referrals of folks. We're always happy to help you find people, but it is important that people have some ideas about, okay, what do I do after this, right?
Right.
So that they don't feel sort of unmoored. That's
Right.
so important. And so I think, the other thing is, I think it can be cool to do a book like this at different stages of your life, because I know certainly for me, the answers that I would have put in this book at 17, are very different than what I would say today, so I think another thing just to remind folks is that your gender is always changing, even if the words you use don't change, or kind of roughly how you think about yourself, the nuances of your gender, all that kind of stuff, that changes as you age, as like you move through the world, as your body changes, like for any reason, right? I mean, and I think that's actually, we sort of have a tendency culturally to talk about gender as this very static thing, when in fact it's always in flux. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And I think the reminder of this book for me is just, gender is a good thing for every person to explore. We should all be exploring it all the time, and it encourages a more healthy society across the board for people of all ages to continue to explore their genders. So I think, Katie, this book has been is going to be, and already is, a real gift to a lot of people, and I'm really excited that you came to talk to us about it today, so thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciated talking to you. I think we had a great conversation.
Yeah. Well, are you on social media anywhere that you want folks to follow you?
I am on Instagram. My name, Katie Leikam. That's probably the best, most active place to follow me.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, folks. Well, we will encourage you to click this teal button at the bottom center of your screen. That is how you can buy the Gender Identity Journal, Prompts and Practices for Exploration and Self-Discovery, directly from Caris. It really does help us when you buy the event books from us. I'll also be adding captions and putting this up on our YouTube channel in a couple days. So if you want to share this event with your friends, we would love that. The more the merrier, always. And of course, if you know folks who are looking for resources related to coming out, supporting their children and their gender journeys, any of those kinds of things, please do send them to Caris, send them to Katie's practice. Check out the resources that are available. So much is online right now, which is a great, strange byproduct of the pandemic, but it's not regionally specific. So now is a great time to get folks who are feeling isolated plugged in, and let's build some community together. So I hope everybody stays safe and well. And thank you again, Katie, for all your work. Have a great day.